We just witnessed the long-awaited debate between Tim Walz and JD Vance, so let's break it down to find out who won. So, throughout the debate, what's interesting was, for the beginning of it, JD Vance seemed to have the edge. So he came across much more calm, composed, slick, prepared, and comfortable on the stage. Whereas in comparison, Tim Walz seemed a little bit on edge. He seemed uncomfortable and just a little tense and uncomfortable. So JD Vance has more experience in public relations in front of television audiences and in heated interviews in comparison to Tim Walz, who, while Tim Walz has more experience in governing as a congressman and as governor, more years in government, his media training doesn't seem as polished as JD Vance. So let's talk about the issues they discussed. So they covered for matters of national security, climate change, immigration, and many more things. So at the beginning, JD Vance seemed to have a stronger impact on the audience, in my view. So the beginning topics were climate change, immigration, and the economy. So on immigration and the economy in particular, those are the top two issues American voters care most about. And that's where JD Vance has the advantage. He can talk about inflation. He could talk about, better economic indicators under the Trump presidency. He can speak strictly about the need for better immigration policy. And that's where they have the edge. And he showed that in his responses, in being more calm, cool, and collected generally. So Tim Walz, he got by, but barely. Tim Walz, he also had this weird, resting face where he just looked a little bit off-putting and odd. Just his resting natural face was a little bit weird. And JD Vance just seemed more calm, more comfortable, and able to speak directly to the camera. Almost a little bit too slick, where it can come across as insincere or kind of smarmy in the way that he, is so able to directly speak to the camera, almost like a Gavin Newsom or a Josh Shapiro. Just almost a little too slick, where you almost don't trust what he has to say. Whereas Tim Walz just came across as a little bit disheveled almost in some of his response, in just some of his mannerisms. Okay, so on climate change, immigration, and the economy, JD Vance seemed to have a bit of the edge. Now, when they got to... So the moderators, Nora O'Donnell and Margaret Brennan, tried to do their best to be neutral. They didn't fact check the debaters. So instead, you can kind of see here, there's a QR code where you could check out live fact checking separately. So they didn't want to appear too biased by doing that. There were a few occasions where I saw the moderators pressed JD Vance more than Tim Walz. Now, you could argue it was warranted, but certainly they pressed JD Vance more so than they did Tim Walz, which could imply that they were somewhat biased. Now, they didn't do it as intensely and aggressively as the previous ABC debate with Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. So that was more clearly fact-checked and heavily, slanted in Kamala Harris's favor. This one, more mildly so, but I would say still so on Tim Walz's behalf. So JD Vance and Tim Walz were asked about statements that they made where they clearly misspoke. So Tim Walz was asked about claiming to be in Tiananmen Square during the massacres there. He ended up being there after the event happened. And he didn't just say that he misspoke, and he embellished. So clearly, Tim Walz has a history of embellishing things that he's been called out for on several occasions. And he fumbled up his answer a little bit there, as did, so I'd say that would be a ding on Tim Walz, except that JD Vance did the same thing when he was asked about calling Trump Hitler. So, how do you walk that back? It's hard to do. So both of their responses were underwhelming on that front. Now here's where Tim Walz turned it around. The football coach at halftime seemed to gain some momentum here when it came to reproductive rights. This is the first time I saw JD Vance stumbling and stuttering his responses. So how can you salvage some of the statements that you've made when he's spoken out so strongly against abortion and women's right to health care, or however you want to put it? So Walz said, "We trust women and we trust doctors." I thought that was a strong statement. He was very compelling in the specific examples he brought up of women that have experienced severe casualties as a result of a lack of access to healthcare. Vance stumbled, he stuttered, he was calm, cool at times, but seemed to just get a little off track. He said it was like a state's issue. He kind of walked back some of the things he had clearly said. It was confusing because he walked back some of his statements and kind of implied that maybe he was more, open to middle ground on this issue. But then at the end, he kind of doubled down and said, no, we're really, we're really pro-life and against, abortion in any way. So he seemed to be dissonant in his response on that. Okay, next was the issue of guns and school shootings, gun deaths being one of the major or leading causes of children deaths in America now. Very tragically, there's this very interesting exchange where Tim Walz mentioned that his son at a volleyball game witnessed a shooting. And interestingly, JD Vance expressed sympathy, humility. He expressed sorrow for Walz's son having to experience that. And I thought that was something that we haven't seen in a recent debate because things are so heated and nasty. So it was nice to see some coming together in those moments. So JD Vance didn't seem to have a lot of solutions, obviously, as the Republican candidate, advocate of gun rights. He's not going to propose any gun restrictions in this debate. In response to school shootings, he said that, okay, so we need better school security, which you hear a lot. Maybe, I think mental health was brought up just a little bit. And I can tell you as a teacher, there's really only so much you can do for school security. I mean, we can't live in, we can't have classes in, lockdown, bulletproof glass, security guards at every corner. There's not the funding for it. Think about how many schools there are in the country. It's literally totally impossible for there to be adequate security to realistically protect against these issues. And look what happened, even when there is an issue, it's, security measures are difficult for teachers to enforce. I'm saying this because I'm a teacher, so I'm, a little bit biased on that issue. What can I say? So Walz spoke about being a gun owner, a hunter, a gun rights advocate, and changing his mind upon discussing the issue with the Sandy Hook parents of victims. So that was, I thought, a compelling moment. Walz did misspeak. I don't know if anybody else caught this. I'm pretty sure I heard him accidentally say that he was friends with school shooters, when what he meant to say was he was friends with the parents of school shooting victims. So I'm pretty sure that was a minor misspoken, gaffe that he made. I don't know if anybody picked it up because he obviously just misspoke in the heat of the moment. I don't think anybody realistically took him at his word on that. So they talked about the need for, so Walz talked about the need for red flag laws, background checks, stricter protections. There wasn't really any movement on the issue. That kind of seemed like a non-starter. Maybe Tim Walz had a little bit of the edge on the issue with the gun rights, with gun control restrictions, reproductive rights. They talked about inflation and housing. They both brought up some relevant points, but neither one made a strong case for their side. That was a tie. With healthcare, JD Vance said something interesting, that Donald Trump saved Obamacare. Now, they were debating what to do about healthcare, who had the better plans, and JD Vance he seemed conflicted in saying that Obamacare was bad for the country. He didn't address Donald Trump's healthcare plan, but he also seemed to say that Donald Trump saved Obamacare while also saying Obamacare was a bad thing, which didn't really make a whole lot of sense. So think about it. But here's the problem with Tim Walz. He didn't really capitalize that on the way that he could have if he were a more seasoned debater and, performer on the stage. So they talked about paid parental leave. J.D. Vance said that we need, choice in how that's done. Walz spoke very generally, didn't really make his case very clearly. So up until this point, they really were tied. J.D. Vance, he won in some categories. Tim Walz won in some areas. But here's where I believe the scales were tipped to one vice presidential candidate's favor, leading them to be the winner of this debate. And that is in this moment here that we'll play a clip of when J.D. Vance and Tim Walz are asked about the importance of democracy and Donald Trump's role in January 7th. And here's what Tim Walz had to say. Check this out.
And it manifested itself because of Donald Trump's inability to say. He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
It's a damning non-answer for you to not talk about censorship. Obviously, Donald Trump and I think that there were problems in 2020. We've talked about it. I'm happy to talk about it further. But you guys attack us for not believing in democracy, the most sacred right under the
So he doesn't answer the question. Do you believe that Donald Trump lost the election? So he just talked about the importance of, maintaining democracy, and January 6th ended up being peaceful and there was a peaceful transfer of power. But when he was specifically asked, did Donald Trump win the election? He wouldn't answer because he knows it's a trick question and there's no winning answer when it comes to being Donald Trump's vice presidential candidate. And that's why I believe that Tim Walz won this debate with that answer there. If it weren't for this moment, I'd say that J.D. Vance would have won this debate because he was calmer, he was cooler, he was more collected, he came across more polished and slicker. He, had what I believe would be some winning responses for the public on like the economy and immigration, and he did well enough in the other areas to kind of just get by. But when it came to asking if Donald Trump won the election previously, he wouldn't give a clear response, which kind of like, undercuts a lot of what he had did throughout this debate, where he would kind of try to find middle ground and sort of like be someone to bring down Trump's extreme statements and make them seem more palatable. There's no way to make this more palatable, and he didn't do that. And that's why I believe that Tim Walz ended up being the victor in this debate. In their closing statements as well, he also just nudged over the finish line just even a little bit further. Tim Walz talked about how Kamala Harris was a candidate of joy, of hope, of, moving the country forward. And J.D. Vance, he kind of was a little bit all over the place in his final statements, talking about energy policy, inflation, Kamala Harris's failures, and that we live in the most beautiful country. He just didn't really seem to have a strong, consistent message besides bashing Kamala Harris, which might be effective. So the race is as close as it could possibly be. It's just about tied, especially in those precious, swing states. So when things are this close, every little thing can make a difference. Do I think that the voters will be swayed by this debate? No. I don't think that either candidate did well enough to, really win this debate. If people just pay attention to like the style of how they presented themselves, maybe they'll be more swayed by J.D. Vance. But if they care about Donald Trump's character and behavior, that final question of does J.D. Vance believe he won? Not being able to answer that clearly and directly, that might tip the scales towards people believing more so in Tim Walz being the winner here. So that's my take on it. If I had to grade each of these candidates, before that final response that we just played there, I'd say J.D. Vance was like at a B or so grade. But then his response to that dropped him down to a C+ because he didn't have a good, clear response. He just changed the subject. He didn't do that very effectively. And that tactic by Tim Walz, I believe, bumped him up to like a B to just edge out J.D. Vance in, doing a little bit better in this debate, but not by much. But those are my thoughts. I think that Tim Walz just barely, just barely beat JD Vance in this final exchange here, but not by enough to make a big difference. So what are your thoughts about this debate performance? Who do you think the winner was? And let me know what grade you would give to each candidate. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.